things we want to make common for every game element, like the player and the enemies, is the horizontal and the depth range. Okay, so we're going to limit where the player and all of the other game elements are going to move. The first that we want to work with is we're going to open the game controller, and here where we have gameplay is to type public float, and we're going to type the same value as we have here in the rolling enemy, which is going to be the depth range. Okay, so right now we just have the depth values, but we're going to make a depth range one. So depth range, and let's set it to 4F as default. Okay, and once we have this value here, we need to set that limitation for the player. Okay, so in the player, we're going to make here a public float depth range. Okay, and actually to make this even better, let's make it a private variable. So private float depth range, and we make once again a property for this. So public float depth range with an uppercase D. And you notice that we have very simple properties here. They simply have a set method. And so a way we can do this is to simply type everything in a single line. So we open curly braces, set, open curly braces again, depth range equals to value, semicolon, curly brace, curly brace. So everything is in a single line. Okay, this might be easier to read, and well, it's not going to make your code harder than it should be. Okay, so you can simply put everything in a single line. It's going to be easier. Okay, so let's just finish what we're doing with the lock C property. And notice this is not mandatory, but we do this because we want to be sure our code is safe. Okay, we're not going to change things that we are not supposed to do. So in the game controller, when we start the game here, okay, of course we set the timer, game timer. So let's put here set the game timer. Now let's type here set variables, and here we're going to type set game mode. And here in set variables, we're going to type player dot depth range equals to depth range, which is the one that we set here. So we're going to save this, and now that the player contains that depth range, we need to set the player's position. Okay, notice that we have a target position here, depending on where we move or the player by either clicking or touching the screen. But we need to make sure that the player's position in the Z-axis is going to be within limits. Okay, and that's on Z, and that's going to be on X later. So here we're going to type make set the player's target position, and we also need to keep the player within bounds. So keep the player within bounds. Okay, so this is going to be a little extensive to do, but later we can simplify this. But anyway, we're going to type if transform.position.z is greater than depth range, then we need to make sure that the player is within that range. So transform.position equals to a new vector 3. X and Y are going to be the same thing. So transform.position.x as the first parameter, transform.position.y as the second parameter, and the final parameter is going to be depth range. Okay, we need to make sure that it's going to be there. Okay, and the other way around is we can check else if transform.position.z is lesser than minus depth range. Okay, then we do the same thing. So transform.position equals to a new vector 3. Okay, we can even copy these values to save some time. Okay, then so we repeat X, we repeat Y, and instead of using depth range, we use minus depth range. So we're going to make sure that it's going to stay within the depth range. Okay, keep the player within the depth range. So we're going to save this, and I'm going to try it out. Okay, so we wait for the compilation to be complete, and now we're going to press the play button. Okay, so the player is here, and we can move it up, and you notice that we have a certain limit. But if we release, then the player can fall. Okay, so there is a logic that we have to adjust here, because the movement for the player is actually happening here. Okay, in the smoothing position, and the logic that we do for making the player move. So we can cut these lines from here and paste them here. Okay, the problem that we had before is that logic would only run while we are clicking the game. Okay, so let's try that now. We're going to save it here, Okay, so we keep the player within depth range after the movement logic, and we give this another try. So we wait for that to be finished, we press play, and after this is done, we're going to move up. You notice that there is no weird movement this time. Okay, we can move, we can keep holding the mouse, we can release it, and it's going to be within the range that we defined, okay, which is great. And now we did this, we need to adjust how the rolling enemy works, because we need to be very careful with consistency. We need to make sure that the game is going to work properly. Well, doesn't matter what values that we use, because the problem that we have is, if we set the depth range to something bigger, like 8, for example, and we press the game, then the player is going to be able to move to positions much further away from the limits of our sphere, okay, of our rolling enemy. So what we have to do here is change the rolling enemy a little bit. So first of all, we're going to have the same depth range that the rolling enemy has. So we're going to type here private float depth range. We're going to make a property for this. So public float depth range set depth range equals to value. Okay, so this is what we have right now. And the depth values are going to be a bit different, okay? Instead of setting the values like we did, so we used -3, -1, 1, and 3, we're going to use percentages here to make this calculation works better, okay? So what do I mean by percentages? We're going to set the values here to be something like 25%, 50%, and 75%, or 0%, 50%, and 100%. We're going to make a little mathematical calculation, so we're going to make sure that the rolling enemy is going to be into certain values of this depth range, okay? So I'm going to type here float, and instead of depth values, we're going to type depth percentages, for example. So it's going to be a bit difficult to understand at first, but this is going to be easier soon enough, okay? So we use depth percentages. And we need to go to where we define where the position of our player would be in the z-axis, okay? So the calculation is going to work like this. We have the depth range, okay? And that value is going to be 4. Let's say it's going to be 5. Let's use that to illustrate. So we want the values to range between -5 and +5. Okay, a way we can do this is we get depth range and multiply it by 2. Okay, or to make this easier to read, we type depth range plus depth range. Let's put that between parentheses. So instead of varying from -5 to 5, this is going to vary from 0 to 10. Okay, that's fine. You don't have to worry about this right now. Now we have to multiply that by one of the possible depth percentages that we have, okay? So if we can define 0, 50, and 100%, for example. So we're going to multiply by depth percentages, and between curly brace, between the brackets, we have the random range, and we put depth percentages here, dot length, okay? So this is going to return one of the percentages that we have. So to make this, to illustrate this very quickly, we can save that, go back to the game, we're going to select the rolling enemy prefab in the prefabs folder, and we have the depth percentages here. Let's set 4 different percentages. We're going to set 0% as the first one, 0.25, so 25% as the second one, or better than this, 0.33. The second one, 0.66, so 66%. And the last one is going to be 1, which stands for 100%. So it might seem a bit different, but we have more or less the same thing that we defined before. We have 4 different values, and they are equally spaced between one another. Okay, we have 4 different possible values. Okay, and now that we have this, the possible outcomes for this call here are either 0, 0.33, 0.66, and 1. If we multiply that by this value here, so it can be roughly, the values could be 0, 3.3, 6.6, and 10. Okay, so the catch here is we're going to put all of this between parentheses, and we're going to decrease depth range. okay, because we have 2 times depth range here to make our calculations easier, so it starts from 0 and moves to another value, and here we decrease that depth range that we added first, okay, so it's going to range between minus depth range and positive depth range and the values that we defined in the percentages that we defined. You might not understand that right now, okay, not just right now, but it's going to work, okay. So we're going to save this. We go to Unity, we wait for the compilation to be finished, and now we're going to press the play button. Okay, so we have a rolling enemy here. It's in the center right now. Then, well, it coincidentally stayed in the center. Let's wait a little bit more until it finds another case. So apparently it's not changing to other positions, so we can do a very quick debug here. Where we have set values, we can print debug.log transform.position.z. Okay, so we're going to slowly try this out. Okay, so depth percentages, apparently everything is fine. Let's save that and go to the console. From time to time we have to do these checks. Now let's press play. Okay, it's going to start at the Z position 0, and then, well, it's pretty much staying at 0. So might be a little problem with the calculation that we're doing, that it is not considering these percentages. Okay, so let's see things carefully here. And now that I remember, we are not setting the depth range yet. So in the game controller, where we set the depth, the rolling enemy object to be like this, we're going to type rolling enemy object dot get component of type rolling enemy dot depth range equals to depth range, just like we did with the player. Okay, so it's important to remember this. It was always getting 0 because the depth range was set to 0. It's not that the calculations were incorrect. Okay, so it's important to remember to do these adjustments from time to time. So right now it's 2.56. Now it's minus 8 because that's sort of the 100%. Okay, it's going to range between a few values. Now we have minus 2.72, so well, it's varying between different values. Okay, it's going to move from the top to the bottom. Okay, so here we have 8, which is the current limit for the player. So well, the player can't escape from all of the rolling enemies. Okay, so I'm going to reduce this depth range back to 4, but I'm just trying to prove a point here. I'm telling you how important it is to keep things consistent. So we change how the depth place of the rolling enemy works. Okay, we change how we set the depth of the rolling enemy just to make sure that it's going to work with whatever depth that we defined here. Okay, it's very important to do this so you don't make any mistakes and give the player the ability to pretty much avoid any possible outcome for the depth of this enemy. Okay, or to make an impossible game as well. Okay, there might be these cases. Always think between making the game too hard or making the game too easy, so you have these little adjustments to make.